In 1898, a French archaeologist named Victor Loret climbed into a tomb in the Valley of the Kings and unwrapped the body of a pharaoh who had been dead for nearly 3,000 years. The pharaoh was Ramses IV. His organs were gone, removed in the embalming process as was standard for Egyptian royalty. But his eye sockets were not empty. Loret found small onions pressed into them, one in each socket, tucked under the eyelids with a level of care that suggested this was not an accident. More onions were found near his ears, more still near his pelvis. This was not a one-time act of a hurried embalmer. Onions have been found in tomb after tomb, dynasty after dynasty, wrapped alongside kings who ruled an empire that lasted longer than almost any in human history. Somewhere along the way, a humble bulb vegetable became sacred enough to be buried inside the eyes of a god king. Onions. Today you can walk into almost any grocery store on the planet and buy a bag of them for less than the price of a cup of coffee. So how did a plant that smells like it belongs in the produce aisle end up worshipped by an ancient civilization as a symbol of eternal life? How did it become currency, medicine, a suspected cause of the plague, and at one point, the center of one of the strangest financial scandals in American history? That mummy was unwrapped in 1898, but the story of the onion starts thousands of years before any Egyptian ever built a pyramid, in a place most people could not point to on a map, somewhere in the mountains of Central Asia, roughly 7,000 years ago. Nobody knows exactly which valley it happened in. Wild onions grew across a huge swath of Central and Southwest Asia, and early foragers almost certainly ate wild alliums long before anyone thought to plant them on purpose. What archaeologists do know is that by around 5,000 years ago, onions were already being deliberately cultivated, not just gathered. That distinction matters. Cultivation means someone noticed which bulbs grew best, which ones stored the longest, which ones tasted less bitter, and then made the decision to plant those specific bulbs again next season, year after year, generation after generation. They did not know the word genetics. They were doing it anyway. Slowly, without writing anything down, without any understanding of chromosomes or heredity, early farmers were selecting for exactly the traits that would make the onion one of the most useful crops a human being could grow. It stored for months without spoiling. It did not need refrigeration, did not need much water once established, and could survive being dried, braided, and hung from a rafter through an entire winter. In a world without refrigeration, that was not a minor convenience. That was the difference between a village that ate through the cold months and one that starved. There is a persistent legend that onions were first discovered by accident, when a wild patch caught fire and early humans, scavenging the burned ground afterward, found the bulbs roasted and sweet underneath the blackened tops. That story is almost certainly folklore rather than documented history. Nobody can verify it, and it shows up in slightly different forms across different cultures, which is usually a sign of a good story rather than a fact. But the fact that some version of that story exists in multiple traditions tells you something. People have always wanted an explanation for how something this useful entered their lives. The truth is less romantic and more impressive. It was not a fire. It was patience, observation, and thousands of years of trial and error. Consider what early cultivators were actually working with. Wild onion species tend to be small, fibrous, and often sharply bitter, an unremarkable plant among thousands of other edible roots and shoots scattered across the same landscape. There was nothing obvious marking it out as the crop that would eventually feed a meaningful share of the human race. What set it apart over centuries of quiet selection was a rare combination of traits rarely found together in a single plant. It tolerated poor, dry soil where other crops struggled. It required relatively little water once established. It could be grown from seed or just as easily from small offshoot bulbs, meaning a farmer did not even need to wait out a full growing cycle to start a new crop. And critically, Once harvested and properly dried, it would keep for months in a cellar or hung from a rafter, resisting rot in a way that fresh greens and most root vegetables simply could not. No refrigeration, no salting, no smoking, no elaborate preservation process. Just air, shade, and time. In a world where a bad harvest could mean an entire village did not survive the winter, a crop like that was not a luxury. It was insurance. By the time the earliest river valley civilizations were forming, the onion had already been folded into supply chains, kitchens, and in some cases, spiritual practice across a wide stretch of Asia. This is the pattern you see again and again with the truly foundational crops in human history. They rarely have a single dramatic origin story with one clear hero. They spread slowly, adopted independently in different regions, refined by thousands of anonymous farmers whose names were never written down anywhere. The onion belongs firmly in that category, unglamorous, essential, and almost completely invisible in the historical record until civilizations powerful enough to write things down finally started paying attention. By around 3,500 years before the present era, onions were showing up in the written record of Mesopotamia, the civilization built between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in what is now Iraq. Sumerian tablets mention onions alongside garlic and leeks as staple crops, rationed out to workers as part of their pay. This is where the story stops being about a wild plant and starts being about an economic system. Onions were not just food in Mesopotamia. They were a unit of exchange, a way of compensating labor, a line item in the ledgers of temple administrators who tracked exactly how many bulbs went to which household. Think about that for a second. Before coined money existed anywhere on Earth, an onion could already function as a form of payment. Mesopotamian garden texts describe onions grown in raised beds alongside other alliums, carefully irrigated using canal systems diverted from the Tigris and Euphrates, a level of agricultural infrastructure that suggests this was not casual backyard gardening. This was organized, state-supported production. Temple bureaucracies, the closest thing the ancient world had to a government accounting department, tracked onion harvest the way a modern ministry might track a strategic grain reserve. Bad harvest meant real consequences. Good harvest meant surplus that could feed builders, soldiers, and priests. The onion had, without any fanfare, become part of the machinery that kept an entire civilization functioning. But it was Egypt that turned the onion into something closer to a religion, and the depth of that reverence is honestly hard to overstate. Egyptian civilization along the Nile flourished for roughly 3,000 years, an almost unbroken span of dynasties, and for most of that time, onions were everywhere in Egyptian life, not just on the table, but in the temple and in the tomb. Egyptians believed the onion's concentric rings, layer wrapped around layer, symbolized eternal life, a structure with no visible beginning and no end. That belief is why onions turn up so often in burial practices, tucked into eye sockets, packed into chest cavities, laid across the bodies of the dead in offerings meant to accompany them into the afterlife. Priests in some regions reportedly refused to eat onions at all, treating them as too sacred, or in some interpretations too impure for regular consumption. A detail that sounds contradictory until you remember that sacred things and forbidden things have always lived close together in religious systems around the world. Onions were also, quite literally, wages. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing centuries after the fact, recorded a claim that had been passed down to him. According to an inscription he was told about on the Great Pyramid at Giza, an enormous sum of silver, roughly 1,600 talents by his account, had been spent just on onions, radishes, and garlic to feed the laborers who built it. Now, that claim is almost impossible to verify, and most historians treat Herodotus's number with real skepticism. He was writing generations after the pyramids were built, working from second-hand information passed down by Egyptian priests, who may have exaggerated for effect. Whether the exact figure holds up under scrutiny remains debated among scholars. But the fact that this detail survived at all The fact that ancient Egyptians themselves believed feeding workers onions was significant enough to inscribe on their most important monument tells you how central this vegetable had become to daily survival in the ancient world. Onions fed empires. Not metaphorically, literally. This is where the story takes a turn nobody expects, because the onion did not stay in Egypt. It traveled. Trade routes threading across the ancient Mediterranean and into Asia carried onion bulbs and onion seed along with grain, cloth, and metal. And by the time Greek and Roman civilizations were flourishing, onions were a kitchen staple from Athens to Rome. Greek athletes competing in the ancient Olympic Games reportedly consumed large quantities of onion, along with drinking onion juice and rubbing the bulb on their bodies, in the belief that it would lighten the blood and improve their performance. There is no clinical basis for any of that, but the ritual persisted for generations because in the ancient world, if enough people believed something worked, that belief itself became a kind of tradition worth repeating. Roman soldiers reportedly ate onions before battle, believing the pungent bulb built strength and courage, essentially the pre-workout supplement of the ancient Mediterranean. Roman writers, including the naturalist Pliny the Elder, cataloged numerous supposed medicinal uses for onions, treating them as a remedy for everything from poor eyesight to dog bites to upset stomachs. Almost none of these claims would survive modern clinical scrutiny. But the volume of ancient medical writing devoted to a single root vegetable shows just how deeply onions were woven into daily life across the classical world. Roman legions, as they expanded across Europe, carried the onion with them the way they carried roads and aqueducts, planting it in newly conquered territory as a practical, low-maintenance crop for feeding garrisons stationed far from home. By the time the Roman Empire had reached its greatest territorial extent, onions were already growing in Britain, Gaul, and Iberia, regions that had never seen the plant before a Roman boot ever touched their soil. Meanwhile, in medieval Europe, onions kept their reputation as both food and medicine, and this is where the story gets genuinely strange. During recurring waves of plague that tore through European towns and cities, some physicians believed onions could actually protect against the disease. Households were advised to place cut onions around a room, the theory being that the vegetable would absorb the poisonous vapors called miasma believed at the time to cause illness. This was not a fringe idea whispered in back alleys. This was a real recommendation given by real physicians in real towns, rooted in the dominant medical theory of the era. It did not work, of course, because plague spreads through bacteria carried by fleas and rodents, not through bad-smelling air. But for centuries, an onion sitting on a table was in the mind of a frightened medieval household a legitimate line of defense against death itself. Pay attention to this next detail because it explains a lot about how differently the past understood disease. There was no germ theory yet. There would not be for another several hundred years. People were doing the best they could with what they had, and what they had was an onion and a prayer. Some folk traditions went even further, claiming that a cut onion left in a sick room would visibly turn black as it absorbed the plague from the air, and that a household could track the severity of an outbreak by how quickly its onions spoiled. There is no evidence this ever actually happened in any way connected to disease, since onions discolor for entirely mundane chemical reasons that have nothing to do with airborne illness. But the belief was widespread enough and persistent enough that variations of it were still being repeated centuries later, long after the underlying medical theory that produced it had been abandoned by serious physicians. Old remedies, it turns out, have a way of outliving the theories that invented them. Onions were not universally loved, however, and this is where the story of class and taste gets interesting. In parts of medieval and early modern Europe, onions and garlic were associated with the diet of peasants and laborers, considered too coarse, too pungent, and too cheap for aristocratic tables. Wealthier households in some regions looked down on strong-smelling alliums the way a modern food snob might sneer at instant ramen. This was not about nutrition. It was about status. An onion was not just an onion. It was a signal of who you were and what you could afford to avoid eating. And yet the same aristocrats who sniffed at the smell of onion on a servant's breath were more often than not eating it anyway, simply disguised. Wealthier medieval kitchens folded onions into rich stews, sauces, and pies, cooked down and blended past the point of easy recognition, allowing the flavor to remain while the visible, low-born vegetable itself disappeared into the dish. It is a strange kind of hypocrisy, the sort that shows up constantly once you start looking for it in food history. The thing itself was beneath you. The flavor it produced was not. That contradiction, dressing up a cheap, humble ingredient until it becomes acceptable at a wealthy table, would echo forward through the history of dozens of other foods, long after the onion itself had lost most of its stigma. The turning point for the onion's global reach came with a single voyage. In 1492, Christopher Columbus sailed west across the Atlantic, and on his second voyage the following year, 1493, he brought onion sets along with other European crops to plant in the Caribbean. This was part of a much larger pattern historians now call the Columbian Exchange, the massive transfer of plants, animals, and diseases between the Old World and the New World that followed European contact with the Americas. Onions were among the very first European crops planted on American soil, arriving decades before wheat took hold in many regions, and centuries before they would become a defining crop of American agriculture. Native peoples of the Americas already had their own wild onion species, and some indigenous communities in what is now the United States had long harvested wild alliums as part of their diet. In fact, one of the most famous cities in the entire country carries the plant's memory in its very name. The Miami, Illinois word for a wild, pungent-smelling onion that grew abundantly along the banks of a river was adapted by early settlers into the name of the settlement that grew up beside it, a place eventually known to the world as Chicago. Think about that for a second. The city where, roughly 3 centuries later, 2 commodities traders would attempt to corner the entire American onion market was itself named indirectly after a wild onion. That is not something anyone made up. That is simply how the etymology actually works. The sweeter, larger cultivated varieties Europeans carried across the Atlantic soon spread rapidly across the continent, adopted by farmers of many backgrounds because the plant was, once again, doing what it always did best. It grew almost anywhere, it required minimal specialized equipment, and it fed people through hard winters when other crops had long since failed or spoiled. If you are finding this interesting, hit subscribe. We cover stories like this every week, and you will not want to miss what comes later in this one, because the onion is about to become the center of one of the strangest financial scandals in the history of American commodities trading. By the time onions reached industrial-era America, they had become a serious commercial crop, grown at enormous scale across states including New York, Michigan, and later California and Texas. And it was in the 1950s that the onion produced a scandal so absurd that it permanently changed federal law. In 1955, 2 commodities traders named Vincent Kasuga and Sam Siegel began quietly buying up onion futures contracts and, more importantly, buying up the physical onions sitting in storage warehouses across Chicago. Futures contracts are essentially bets on what a commodity will be worth at a future date, and by controlling both the paper contracts and the actual onions stored in warehouses, Kasuga and Siegel effectively cornered the entire market. They controlled so much of the physical supply that they were able to manipulate the price almost at will. First, they drove prices up. Then, once other traders and farmers had committed to contracts based on those inflated prices, Kasuga and Siegel began dumping their enormous onion reserves onto the market all at once. Prices collapsed. Onion prices fell so far, so fast, that by the end of 1955, a 50-pound bag of onions was reportedly selling for less than the bag itself cost to manufacture. Farmers across the Midwest were financially devastated. Some were left holding contracts worth a fraction of what they had paid, watching years of labor evaporate because 2 men in Chicago had figured out how to squeeze an entire commodities market for personal profit. Kasuga himself later described the entire operation with a kind of shameless candor, reportedly bragging to reporters about how easily the scheme had worked and how little regulatory oversight had stood in his way. The fallout was significant enough that it reached the United States Congress. Farmers and their representatives testified about ruin, about entire seasons of labor rendered worthless overnight by a manipulation they had no way of seeing coming. In 1958, lawmakers passed the Onion Futures Act, a piece of federal legislation that banned the trading of onion futures contracts entirely, a direct and permanent response to what regulators viewed as an intolerable abuse of the commodities system. Here is the detail that makes this genuinely strange. That law is still in effect today, more than 60 years later. Of every single agricultural commodity traded in the United States, wheat, corn, soybeans, cattle, pork bellies, coffee, sugar, the onion remains the one crop that federal law specifically forbids trading as a futures contract. All because of a scheme cooked up by two men more than 70 years ago. Economists have argued for decades, with real data to back them up, that this ban has actually made onion prices more volatile over time rather than less, since futures markets typically exist to smooth out exactly this kind of price swing. And yet, the ban remains, an odd little fossil of 1950s financial history sitting quietly inside the federal code, completely unnoticed by the overwhelming majority of people who buy onions every single week. Not bad for a vegetable most people assume has a boring, uneventful history. The 20th century also brought industrialization to the onion in less scandalous but arguably more transformative ways. Mechanized harvesting equipment, developed and refined through the middle of the century, replaced armies of hand laborers who had once walked fields pulling bulbs by hand row after row under the open sun. Dehydration technology allowed companies to produce onion powder and dried onion flakes at industrial scale, turning a perishable fresh vegetable into a shelf-stable ingredient that could be shipped anywhere on Earth without refrigeration, packed into everything from instant soup mixes to seasoning blends to fast food hamburgers assembled by the millions every single day. A vegetable that once required careful storage in a cool, dry cellar could now sit on a supermarket shelf in powdered form for years without spoiling. A transformation every bit as significant in its own quiet way as the invention of canning had been for other perishable foods a century earlier. This is where the story turns dark for a moment, because the labor behind fresh onion production did not disappear when the machines arrived. It shifted, and in many cases, it shifted onto the backs of migrant and seasonal agricultural workers, often working for low wages under grueling conditions in extreme heat, bent over for hours pulling bulbs from dry, dusty soil. This was not a small or short-lived arrangement. Beginning in 1942, the United States government formalized a guest worker arrangement known as the Bracero program, bringing hundreds of thousands of Mexican laborers north each year to work fields across the country, including onion fields in states such as Texas, California, and Georgia. The program ran for more than 2 decades, finally ending in 1964, and while it filled a genuine labor shortage during and after the Second World War, it also became notorious for substandard housing, unsafe working conditions, and, in a significant number of documented cases, unpaid wages that workers never recovered. Advocacy groups and labor investigations in the decades since, extending through modern guest worker visa programs still in use today, have repeatedly documented wage theft, unsafe conditions, and exploitation among the very workers responsible for keeping onion prices low enough for a supermarket shopper to barely notice the cost. Field temperatures during summer harvest in states like Georgia and Texas can climb well above 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and heat-related illness among agricultural laborers remains a documented occupational hazard, one that disproportionately affects the same low-wage migrant workforce that has picked onions in this country for generations. This is the part that does not get enough credit. Every time you toss a cheap bag of onions into your cart without a second thought, there is a long, largely invisible chain of human labor behind that price tag, and it has not always been treated fairly. Plant breeding also transformed the onion in the 20th century, and one story in particular stands out. In 1931, a farmer near the town of Vidalia, Georgia, planted onion seed, expecting the usual sharp, tear-inducing bulb, and instead got something unexpectedly mild and sweet. The unusually low-sulfur soil of that specific region of Georgia had altered the chemistry of the crop. Word spread, demand grew, and by the latter half of the 20th century, the Vidalia onion had become such a valuable regional brand that the state of Georgia passed legislation legally restricting which counties are allowed to call their onions Vidalia onions at all. It is essentially the agricultural equivalent of champagne, a name tied by law to a specific patch of dirt. And it started with nothing more than an accident of soil chemistry that one farmer happened to notice. Meanwhile, breeders in more recent decades have chased an entirely different goal, an onion that will not make you cry. Standard onions release a chemical compound when their cells are ruptured by a knife, an enzyme reaction that produces a volatile gas which then reacts with the moisture in human eyes to form a mild sulfuric acid, which is what actually triggers tears. It is not sadness. It is chemistry. A defense mechanism the plant evolved for an entirely different purpose, deterring insects and animals from eating it in the wild, that happens to work equally well on a home cook standing at a cutting board. Through decades of selective breeding, companies have developed low-sulfur varieties, sometimes marketed under names like Sunions, engineered specifically to reduce that eye-watering reaction without sacrificing flavor. The development process reportedly took more than 30 years of patient crossbreeding, an entire human generation spent chasing a single, deceptively simple goal. Thousands of years after ancient farmers first learned to select for storage life and mild taste, modern breeders are still refining the exact same plant for the exact same reasons: comfort, convenience, and a slightly better kitchen experience. Today, the onion is one of the most widely grown vegetable crops on the planet. China produces far more onions than any other country on Earth, growing an enormous share of global supply, followed by India, the United States, and a cluster of other major agricultural producers spread across nearly every populated continent, including Egypt, the same country where this whole story began. Worldwide production runs into the tens of millions of metric tons annually, and the global onion market is valued in the tens of billions of dollars, a figure that continues to climb as global demand for processed and dehydrated onion products grows alongside fresh consumption. The average person in many onion-heavy cuisines, including India and parts of the Middle East, consumes a genuinely startling quantity of onions per year, in some estimates well over 40 pounds per person annually, roughly the weight of a medium-sized dog consumed one meal at a time. In India specifically, onion prices have become such a politically sensitive issue that sudden spikes in the retail cost of onions have, on multiple occasions in recent decades, become front-page news and a genuine factor cited in regional elections. Think about that for a second. A vegetable that costs almost nothing has more than once helped move actual votes. But the onion is far more than just food, and this next part tends to catch people off guard. Onion skins, the papery outer layers most people throw straight into the trash, have been used for centuries as a natural dye, producing warm, golden, and rust-colored tones on fabric and famously on dyed Easter eggs in numerous European folk traditions. Researchers have also studied compounds found in onions, including a group called flavonoids for potential anti-inflammatory and antioxidant properties, though it is worth being honest here. Preliminary laboratory findings are not the same thing as a proven medical treatment, and onions are not a miracle cure for anything, whatever a headline might imply. More surprising still, agricultural researchers have experimented with onion waste, the roughly 1/10 or more of every commercial harvest that never makes it to a grocery shelf due to size, blemish, or shape, as a feedstock for biogas and even electricity generation. In parts of the United Kingdom, food waste, including discarded onions, has been used to help power municipal facilities, converting rotting produce that would otherwise sit in a landfill into usable electricity fed directly into the local grid. A vegetable that once symbolized eternal life in an Egyptian tomb is now, in some very literal sense, helping keep the lights on. And in a detail that would have sounded like science fiction to a Sumerian farmer, contemporary researchers have also explored onion-derived compounds in fields ranging from battery technology to biodegradable packaging, part of a much broader push to find industrial uses for agricultural waste that would otherwise simply be discarded. None of this has replaced the plant's original job. Every single day, onions still form the base layer of an enormous share of the world's cooking, the first ingredient into the pan in kitchens from Lagos to Lahore to Los Angeles, chopped, sweated, and softened before almost anything else happens in the pot. That has not changed in thousands of years, and it is unlikely to change anytime soon. It was there thousands of years ago, in the hands of anonymous farmers in Central Asia who had no word for genetics and did the work anyway. It was there when Sumerian scribes tracked it as a form of payment on clay tablets, before coined money existed anywhere on the planet. It was there when Egyptian priests packed it into the eye sockets of a pharaoh dead for 3,000 years, a symbol of eternity wrapped layer over layer. It was there feeding Roman soldiers before battle, and it was there hanging in medieval European homes as a supposed shield against a plague it could do nothing to stop. It was there on the second voyage of Christopher Columbus, crossing an ocean into a hemisphere that had never seen it before. And it was there, quietly, in the very name of a city that would one day become one of the largest in the world. It was there when two men in Chicago cornered an entire commodities market and accidentally rewrote federal trading law, a law that, absurdly, still stands today. It was there, in the hands of migrant laborers bent over dusty fields under a scorching sun, long after machines had taken over most of the rest of the harvest. It was there, in a laboratory, patiently bred over 30 years into a version of itself that would no longer make you cry. And it is there right now, sitting in a bowl on a kitchen counter somewhere near you, waiting to be sliced into a pot of something simmering on a stove. Sacred enough to be buried with a god king, cheap enough today to buy in bulk without a second thought, tossed into a cart alongside milk and bread without a moment's hesitation. That contradiction, worshipped once, ignored now, is the whole story. And it is a contradiction that keeps showing up whenever you dig into the history of the things people eat without thinking. Not bad for a lumpy, papery bulb that makes you cry before it even makes it into the pan. If any part of this surprised you, let me know in the comments which one it was, because I genuinely want to know. And if you want more stories like this, the hidden histories behind the ordinary things sitting in your kitchen right now, do me a favor and hit subscribe. I will see you in the next one.